Good evening, dreamers. Welcome back to another chapter of our ongoing exploration into the strange, the shadowed, and the sublime. Tonight, before we delve into our eerie tale, a quick reminder. Every night at 8 p.m. Eastern Standard, I bring you original, handcrafted horror narrations designed to fit our weekly themes. This week, we continue stepping into the abyss of our experimental medications theme, where science pushes boundaries, ethics blur, and the line between salvation and damnation becomes dangerously thin. Have a theme in mind for future stories? Drop your suggestions in the comments, or join the discussion about tonight's tale. If you enjoy these nightly chills, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell so you never miss a story. Tonight's tale invites you into the life of Aldous Valieri, a man who has walked the earth since time itself was young. A being of shadow, blood, and power, Valieri has spent centuries crafting an empire, weaving his darkness into the fabrics of the world. But as the modern age dawns, his greatest experiment yet promises to shatter the eternal night he has known. What happens when immortality meets the human condition? When the endless hunger for life collides with the fragile beauty of love? Settle in, dreamers. Tonight's story is one of ambition, transformation, and the ultimate price of tampering with fate. This is Daywalker. Part 1. The Shadows of Empires. I have always lived in shadow. It's not a metaphor, though I suppose it could be. My existence has been one of literal darkness, the sun, an eternal enemy I've never been able to conquer. For as long as I can remember, though memory is a slippery thing when stretched across centuries, I have walked the night, collecting treasures, witnessing revolutions, and surviving where others fell. I cannot recall the moment I became what I am. That knowledge is lost to time, a hazy smear in the earliest chapters of my existence. What I do know is this: I have been alive longer than any man should be, and yet I'm not alive at all. It was during the Industrial Revolution, when the air reeked of coal and ambition, that I decided to step from the shadows, not into the light, no, but into the world of men. The world was changing in ways that even I, ancient and detached, could not ignore. Machines roared, cities rose, and science began to encroach on the mysteries that had once belonged solely to the supernatural. It was an age of invention, and I intended to make it mine. I founded my company under the name Aldous Valieri, a name I have worn for centuries, like a suit tailored to fit the times. In truth, I am the only Valieri, but mortals prefer their stories neat, their legacies tied up in generational vows. So, I invented a lineage, a dynasty of heirs who would carry on my name long after the man himself should have died. The trick was simple: disappear every few decades, then return as my own son, grandson, or great-grandson. They never questioned it. The company began as a modest endeavor, an apothecary producing remedies for the ailments of the age, laudanum for the restless, tonics for the consumptive. But I had grander ambitions. I poured centuries of wealth into laboratories and hired the brightest minds I could find. Alchemists turned chemists, physicians who believed in the impossible. I gave them a mission that seemed absurd to them at first: to create a medicine that could defy nature itself. For you see, I have always envied the day, the warmth of sunlight on skin, the golden glow of a morning sky. I've only ever known these things through the eyes of others, stolen memories from the minds of those I feed upon. And so, I task my scientists with creating what I call the Daywalker Serum. Of course, they know it by a different name, something more scientific and respectable. Luminexer. Decades passed. My company grew. It thrived in the twilight of the Industrial Revolution, then flourished in the chaos of the two world wars. By the time the 20th century roared into being, Valieri Pharmaceuticals was a titan of industry. I sat at its helm, the supposed heir of my own legacy, watching as humanity's understanding of biology and chemistry grew even closer to unlocking the secrets of life. And I hoped, the curse of my unlife. Now it's the year 2024, and my patience has finally been rewarded. My team, brilliant, obedient, and utterly ignorant of my true nature, have done what I once thought was impossible. After centuries of work, countless trials, and the quiet disposal of many volunteers, they have succeeded. I hold the vial in my hand, the amber liquid glinting faintly under the fluorescent lights of my own private lab. Luminexer, my Daywalker Serum, the culmination of centuries of effort and ambition.
You understand the risks?
Dr. Shapiro says, his voice trembling just slightly. He is a nervous man, but competent, and I've kept him alive for longer than most. I understand, I reply, though I hardly care. Risks are for mortals. I have faced the jaws of death more times than I can count and emerged unscathed.
The side effects?
He begins, but I wave him off. I've read the reports. Diminished appetite. I suppress a smirk. He doesn't know the true extent of what it means for me. A need for a more human diet. I'll manage.
And the blood work suggests...
Enough, Shapiro. My voice sharpens, and he recoils slightly. Leave me. He hesitates, but only for a moment. No one disobeys me. Not for long. When the door closed behind him, I am alone. I stare at my vial, my thoughts swirling like the liquids inside. For centuries, I have ruled the night. I have been a predator, a shadow, a god among men. And yet, I have always been bound by the chains of my own nature. But now, perhaps, I will finally be free. I uncork the vial and drink. The taste is bitter, metallic, like the air before a storm. And I feel it almost immediately, a warmth spreading throughout me, alien and disconcerting. For the first time in centuries, I feel something other than cold. I do not know what awaits me in the light, but I will find out. Part 2. The Allure of the Day. The first time I walked into daylight, I felt like a man reborn. The warmth on my skin was almost unbearable, a sensation so foreign it bordered on pain. I stood there on the terrace of my penthouse, the sun cresting over the skyline, gilding the world in gold. My shadow stretched long and thin behind me, a testament to the centuries I had spent confined to darkness. I expected to burn. I half wanted to, if I'm honest. There was a poetry to it, a creature of night consumed by the very thing it had sought for so long. But the flames never came. Instead, there was only light, and I found myself laughing, a sound that startled even me. The next few weeks were a blur of discovery. Morning spent watching the world wake up, afternoon wandering parks I had only ever seen by moonlight. I had to adjust, of course. The Daywalker serum came with its inconveniences. My strength was diminished, my senses dulled, food became a necessity, though it was more nuisance than pleasure, and my hunger for blood, though quieter, still lingered in the back of my mind like an itch I couldn't quite scratch. It was during one of these forays into the daylight world that I met her. I had wandered into a coffee shop on a whim, curious about the ritual that seemed to hold so much power over mortals. The smell was intoxicating, rich, bitter, earthy. I ordered something at random, a suggestion from the barista, and took a seat near the window, letting the sunlight pour over me. That's when I saw her. She sat alone at a corner table, a book in her hands, her lips pursed in thought. She wasn't beautiful in the way that mortals often describe beauty. Her features were sharp, her eyes dark and intense, like storm clouds gathering on the horizon. She had an aura of quiet defiance, a sense that she belonged to herself entirely. The book caught my attention first. Notes from the Underground. Dostoevsky, an old friend of mine. Though I had not read him in decades, I watched her for a moment, intrigued by the way she moved, the way her fingers lingered on the edges of the pages, as if she were savoring each word. I didn't plan to speak to her. I never do. But something about the way she sat there, so utterly absorbed, made me forget myself. Dostoevsky, I said, my voice low and smooth. An interesting choice for a sunny afternoon. She looked up, startled, her eyes narrowing slightly as they met mine. I expected the usual reaction, an immediate softening, a tilt of the head, a telltale sign of my charm at work. But she only stared at me unflinching, as if she were sizing me up.
It's not the weather that determines what I read,
she replied, her voice calm but laced with a quiet challenge.
It's the mood.
And what mood does Dostoevsky suit? I asked, taking a seat across from her without waiting for an invitation. She raised an eyebrow but didn't object.
Introspection, the kind that makes you uncomfortable.
I smiled, genuinely amused. Uncomfortable introspection, a rare indulgence. She tilted her head, studying me.
You don't strike me as the type to indulge in much of anything uncomfortable.
You'd be surprised, I said, leaning back in my chair. What is it he says? Man is a creature that can get accustomed to anything, this scoundrel. Her lips twitched, almost a smile.
So you've read it?
Many times, though I'll admit it's been a while. She closed the book, her fingers brushing over the cover.
Then you must have an opinion on it. What do you think of his argument? That true freedom comes from suffering?
I paused, caught off guard by the question. It wasn't often that mortals spoke to me this way, with no trace of deference or fear. I found it refreshing. I think, I said slowly, that Dostoevsky underestimated the human capacity for self-delusion. Suffering doesn't make us free. It only reminds us of our chains. Her eyes darkened, and for a moment I thought I had offended her. But then she smiled, a small private smile that made something stir in me, something I hadn't felt in centuries.
That's an interesting perspective,
she said.
Though I think he'd argue that recognizing the chain is the first step to breaking them.
Perhaps, I allowed, but I found that some chains are unbreakable. She didn't respond immediately, her gaze flickering over me as if she were trying to decipher something. Then she extended her hand.
Inessa.
Aldous, I said, taking her hand. Her skin was warm, and for a moment, I was acutely aware of my own coldness. The conversation that followed was unlike any I'd had in years, decades perhaps. She was sharp, quick-witted, unafraid to challenge me. We spoke of philosophy, of literature, of the peculiar absurdity of human existence. She had a way of looking at the world that was both cynical and strangely hopeful, a contradiction that fascinated me. When she finally stood to leave, I felt a pang of something I couldn't quite name. Will I see you again? I asked, surprising myself with the question. She hesitated, then smiled.
If you're lucky.
And then she was gone, leaving me alone in the sunlight, my coffee untouched and my thoughts racing. For the first time in centuries, I felt something shift inside me. It wasn't hunger or ambition or even lust. It was something softer, something I had almost forgotten how to feel. Hope. Over the weeks that followed, I found myself returning to that coffee shop, though I told myself it was mere curiosity. Inessa was there more often than not, always with a book, always lost in thought. Each time our conversations grew longer, more intimate. She was unlike anyone I had ever known, unimpressed by wealth, uninterested in power. She saw through the veneer of Aldos Valieri, the billionaire, and spoke to me as if I were simply a man. And for the first time in centuries, I began to wonder if that was all I wanted to be. Part 3. The Weight of Forever. The seasons had begun to blur in a way they never had before. When you're eternal, time stretches endlessly, a vast, unchanging expanse. But now, for the first time, I felt the days slipping through my fingers. Each moment with Anessa burned brighter, sharper, as if lit from within by its own impermanence. We lived simply, though I could have given her the world. My wealth was vast, my resources boundless. But she cared very little for extravagance. Her joy came from the little things, the smell of fresh rain on cobblestones, the crackle of a fire on winter nights, the quiet intimacy of shared silence. I found myself drawn into her rhythm, captivated by the beauty she found in the mundane. The Daywalker serum continued to quietly work its magic. My strength had long since faded, my senses dulled to human levels. The hunger for blood disappeared entirely, replaced by an appetite for bread, wine, and the occasional indulgence of chocolate cake, Inessa's favorite. We were sitting in the garden one afternoon, the spring air alive with the scent of lilacs. She reached up to smooth my hair, her fingers brushing against my temple, and then she stopped.
Look at this,
She said, plucking a strand and holding it to the light.
your first gray hair.
She laughed, but I couldn't. My hand instinctively went to my temple, searching for the place where the hair had been, as if I could erase it, undo what it meant. She tilted her head, her smile softening.
It's not the end of the world, you know. It happens to everyone eventually.
Not to me, I thought. Not before. But now it was happening. I was aging. Slowly, yes, but undeniably. The thought should have terrified me, and perhaps it did, in some small, secret part of myself. But as I looked at her, at the faint lines beginning to form around her eyes, the silver threads weaving through her dark hair, I felt something else entirely. Relief. For the first time in centuries, I was not alone in the march toward the inevitable. The years passed quietly, and with them came more changes. My reflection, once a stranger to me, began to grow familiar. Lines etched themselves into my face. My hair turned silver. My body grew slower, softer. Inessa aged too, though she carried it with grace that left me in awe. She was as beautiful to me as ever, perhaps more so, because every line, every wrinkle was a testament to the life we had built together. We never spoke of my past. She never asked, and I never told. To her, I was simply Aldous Valieri, a man who had lived a long and interesting life, a man who loved her, and that was enough. But as the end drew closer, I found myself reflecting on the life I would leave behind, the centuries of darkness, the endless nights spent chasing power, wealth, pleasure. It all seemed so hollow now, so meaningless compared to the warmth of her hand in mine, the sound of her laughter, the quiet moments we shared in the fading light of day. One evening, as we sat together on the porch, watching the sun set in a blaze of orange and gold, she turned to me and said,
Do you ever think about forever?
I smiled, my fingers lacing through hers. I used to, but not anymore.
Why not?
She asked, resting her head against my shoulder. Because forever is empty, I said. It's these moments that matter, the ones we have now. She didn't reply, but her grip on my hand tightened, and I knew she understood. We grew older together, our lives a quiet symphony of love and loss, joy and sorrow. The world went and changed around us, as if in a hurry, but we remained constant, two souls bound together by something neither time nor death could touch. And when the end would come, it would be gentle as a fading dream. As I lay beside her, my body, once unyielding, now fragile, gave me one more winter morning. As the snow fell softly outside, I felt no fear, only a deep, abiding peace. Anessa was there, her hand in mine, her eyes filled with tears and love.
I'll see you soon,
She whispered, her voice breaking. Forever had always been my curse, but with her, it became a gift. Because love, I realized, was the only entity that ever truly mattered. I closed my eyes, and then darkness.